You're very, very kind. Thank you. Welcome to a wonderful day. It may be the first time that Katie and I have been together on stage, working together as a team, looking at some of the things that I think are going to be very, very powerful and a life-changing day. I have always been a huge, huge fan of hers and have done the work myself, and you're all in for a great treat this afternoon. I have undertaken a project. I started on January the 1st of this year, and I'll be finishing it on December the 31st. It's a new book that I'm living. For the first time, I think, in my life, I've begun to do something that is having more of an impact on me than I think it'll have on anyone who reads it. It has changed my life in a very profound and dramatic way every day. I was listening to the whole controversy around James Fry and A Million Little Pieces. Most of you know what I'm speaking about, I think, don't you? Well, there was a huge bestseller last year. It's called A Million Little Pieces, and it was about a young man who had been a drug addict and an alcoholic, had tried every kind of drug that there was, and ended up at the beginning of the book being dropped off up in Minnesota at a rehab center. And the story is the story of his experience going through 6 weeks of intense rehab, trying to get himself clean from this life of drugs that he had been participating in since he was about 15 or 16 years old, and he was in his late 20s at this time. Well, it became a very hugely popular bestseller because it was beautifully written, and he went on Oprah, and then they discovered that it was just an amazing insight. They found out that someone who does drugs doesn't always tell the truth. As my daughter said, duh. It was published as a memoir, and there's sort of a loose interpretation of what it means to write a memoir, and whether this comes under the category of fiction or nonfiction, or whether you're allowed to play with facts and so on. And all of this controversy could have been resolved with a brief little paragraph at the beginning of the book that said some of the facts in the book have been altered to make the story better, or to protect the people who were a part of the experience that he went through, or whatever. But that wasn't in there, and so he went on Oprah, and then she found out that he had fabricated some of the details. But in the whole process of all of that, Oprah being concerned about what had it done for her reputation and whether or not these facts were true or not, was the much larger picture of how many people who were really profoundly impacted as drug addicts and alcoholics, and were able to come out of that world, that imprisoned world. And it's very close to me in my life, because in my own family I have one of my children who right now, today, is profoundly struggling with that very same thing, and has been for the past 10 years or so. So I'm sensitive to it as well. Anyway, A Million Little Pieces was deeply impactful to many, many people. And the controversy stirred, and I saw this young man being raked through the coals because he had changed some of the facts and so on, and that became the whole emphasis on this book. So I called James and told him that I would be absolutely willing to publish anything that he wrote in the future. And my publisher agreed to that. While he was going through this rehabilitation experience of his, he came across a book that I had read when I was taking a philosophy course back at the university, at the University of Michigan in 1964. 1965, I think it was, or 1966. It's a book that was written 2,500 years ago. I remember when I was reading it, I was touched by it, and I remember saying, it's about time they wrote something like this. And then I found out that that old line that when the student is ready, the teachers will appear, became very, very clear, because it had been out there for thousands of years, 500 years before the Bible, for the New Testament, was even thought of. And the book is called the Tao Te Ching, or the Book of the Way. And it's the foundation for the practice. It's not a religion, as I've been researching Taoism, which is spelled Taoism, Tao, the Tao. The word Tao is just a word that means the way. And the opening line of the Tao says, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. So the minute that you put a label on it, you've lost it. It is something that transcends dualities, beginnings and ends. It's the word for the source, the word for all that is. And one of the most profound teachings of the Tao is that the Tao does nothing, but it leaves nothing undone. And it's a really profound teaching. I remember when I sat down to write the book Inspiration, Your Ultimate Calling. And I called it Your Ultimate Calling because I really believed that it is our calling to live an inspired life. And an inspired life is a life in which we return ourselves back to spirit. One of the verses in the Tao speaks about the return trip, that those who understand the way understand that we show up here from an invisible source, and our whole objective in being here is to return to it. It's a return trip. And constantly I call this the state of God realization, that it's within each and every one of us. If we decide that we're going to make this return trip and live a God-realized life, which has absolutely nothing to do with religion. It's funny, I was reading Matthew Fox last night, Original Blessing, his answer to original sin. And I came across a quote from Carl Jung. Now, I was a Jungian therapist. I studied Carl Jung a great deal when I was a doctoral student. And Carl Jung, I didn't know that he had said this. I looked up the quote last night. He said, the surest way to lose your soul is to believe in a God outside of yourself. And then he said, there's an awful lot of people who have gone to church on a regular basis who've been on a one-way trip to losing their soul, who believe in something that is external to ourselves. And if you begin to study this idea of a God or a source or a spirit or an intelligence that is not something that is external to you, but that in fact is you, is the source of all of us. In the Tao, they call this the world of the 10,000 things. And the 10,000 things is just the ultimate number to represent everything that is in the material world. So that everything that originates in the world of source, in the world of non-being, all being comes from that place. And all the great spiritual texts that have been written about this have always intrigued me, and the number around it is, when I sat down to write Inspiration, I knew that I was going to write 18 chapters. And somehow that number has always been intriguing. And it's an interesting in spiritual text that the number 18 stands for one infinite source. One infinite source, 18. So all of you born on the 18th, you get something for nothing today. Some advice is what you get. But reading the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Bible, the text that was written thousands of years ago, also contemporaneously with the Tao, had 18 verses in it, 18 chapters. It's